Thank you for joining this recorded presentation. My name is Neil, and I am a staff attorney at the Public Health Law Center. I'll be sharing with you the highlights of a recently published paper studying the tobacco industry's increasing use of human rights rhetoric and narratives, specifically British American tobacco. I want to start with an acknowledgement that the Public Health Law Center is located at Mitchell-Hamline School of Law in St. Paul, Minnesota. We are in the indigenous homelands of the Dakota people, which is shared territory with other peoples who lived and still live in the region, and whose cultural and spiritual lifeways continue today in spite of historical wrongs. I will also take this opportunity to note that when I talk about tobacco, I'm specifically referring to commercial tobacco products, and not the sacred use of tobacco as is practiced in some tribal communities. I'd also like to share the intersectional principles that guide us at Public Health Law Center. We work to promote health equity, using law and policy to positively affect the core determinants of health, and for the realization of the highest attainable level of health for everyone. This is the fundamental human right to health, as is recognized in international human rights law. I'll finally note that when this project began, I was a postdoctoral scholar with UCSF's Center for Tobacco Control Research and Education, and it's with their support and the resources provided by the Truth Tobacco Industry Documents Archives that are at UC San Francisco that we were able to delve into the work. On Human Rights Day in 2020, British American Tobacco released their Human Rights Report. This was the first time anyone in the industry had dedicated so much ink to spotlight human rights and praise the good work that BAT wants everyone to think it's doing to protect, respect, promote, and fulfill fundamental human rights. Now, this came as a little surprising. The industry received significant criticism for their direct and indirect role in perpetuating human rights violations and concerns around the world, but BAT, coming out so boldly with a flagship document purporting to align with the UN Human Rights Framework, was new to us. And perhaps at a betrayal of my own prejudices, those of us who are familiar with human rights, the laws, the frameworks, the guiding principles, never really thought of BAT or the industry generally as on our side, especially with respect to the fundamental right to health, which on its own terms runs counter to the basis of the tobacco industry. Tobacco consumption in any form carries risks both to users and often those around users, even if they themselves are non-users. The industry has for years been accused of violating or enabling violations of human rights, not the least of which is the continued profiting off of a product that will harm its consumers, addict them to maintain that harm, and often cause secondary harm to people who never elected to use tobacco in the first place. And, of course, for decades, they lied about their products. It's been barely over 20 years since the industry was forced to admit that their products are harmful and addictive, which they knew a lot longer than that. And though how much has changed since they had to make those admissions remains in question. And that brings us to where this study, all of this really began, BAT's first ever human rights report. The report highlights BAT's long-standing commitment to respect the human rights of their employees, partners, and the communities they work in, how they have achieved much change in the past 20 years, and how they are raising the bar to address the human rights impacts of their global business and supply chains. But they didn't really consider health and safety for consumers or children or local communities to be the human rights issues that they were concerned with. Reducing health impacts in the form of selling consumers potentially less harmful, but still harmful products does get a mention, but it's not clear BAT is concerned with the very health hazards they admit to driving. They talk about COVID vaccine development, they talk about Black Lives Matter, they talk about LGBT+ inclusivity. They even talk about the importance of achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and notably SDG 3 on health, which specifically calls for the ratification and implementation of the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. What they don't talk about is the right to health. And while they do make a lot of mention of the importance of reducing the health impact of their business, they do so while framing it as merely a consumer choice, like that someone might make between soda and diet soda, And while saying that BAT will continue to invest in the cultivation, manufacture, and sale of combustible tobacco products as a primary revenue stream for their business. So this left us with a few questions. What transformations has BAT actually done? And where did they start? And where did they end up ultimately? Since supposedly they're on their journey to a better tomorrow. We wanted to unpack and backtrack BAT's journey to their human rights report to understand and describe their evolution, if, as they claimed, they have changed so much over the past 20 years, and see if we could divine what they were saying and to whom. In a certain sense, BAT is correct to say that they have long been a champion of at least one thing: choice. The choice to start using a tobacco product. Addiction science and whether someone ever chooses to initiate and sustain tobacco use notwithstanding, BAT has been consistent in arguing that it is a consumer's choice to initiate with tobacco, a consumer's choice to continue using tobacco, and a consumer's choice to quit. Prior to 1997, BAT's approach on human rights was to not touch them at all. BAT, like many large companies, was doing business all around the world, including in countries with questionable to abysmal human rights records. When asked in 1993 by Amnesty International to comment on torture in China, then Chairman Patrick Sheehy responded by saying it would be inappropriate to comment, not to discourage torture. This sentiment had echoes in 1997 as well, in the wake of Royal Dutch Shell's very public flogging from protesters decrying its involvement with Nigeria's government and the spate of human rights violations occurring in that country. But Shell's shellacking triggered some in BAT to think about how their company should prepare for human rights scrutiny. In April of 1997, BAT officials held a meeting to discuss the company's own potential for scrutiny in trouble spots like Nigeria. The summation of this meeting was that BAT considered human rights in the broad sense important, but that the company itself was neutral in local politics. Local politics meaning respect for fundamental human rights. And the company believed it provided significant benefits to people living in those countries that would be lost if BAT were to extricate, along with the loss of revenues and potential sales in a country like China, were BAT to shut down operations. Nevertheless, in May of the same year, a subsequent discussion amongst BAT's leaders revealed a slow shift in thinking about human rights. As one executive wrote at that time, human rights, corporate social responsibility, kind of merged together, appears to be the next generic issue, and the company needed strategies for dealing with those pressures that added shareholder value. Those strategies included building relationships with realistic NGOs, meaning those which recognize wealth generation and economic development as valid and are prepared to work with business. Beyond that, BAT cannot solve all the problems of society, which presumably includes the ones that they themselves create and benefit from. BAT felt that governments and international entities are better equipped for addressing human rights more properly than business, and that business could support these other actors. This support could include human rights promotion, at least within how a business conducted itself, as well as in what was then the emerging concepts for sustainable development. This time, in 1998 and 1999, when Amnesty International, then a realistic NGO, came knocking, BAT responded more warmly and openly, earning praise from the Amnesty representative. Letters between BAT's head of international development and the chair of Amnesty's UK business group suggest hopes for a relationship. In June of 1999, in a reply to Amnesty, BAT noted that they were working on a social report to discuss the company's corporate social responsibility, and such a document could be a good medium for a statement of support for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that Amnesty's support would be necessary. There's a gap between 1999 and 2008, at least insofar as the Truth Tobacco Industry Documents archives could attest, as well as what is available on BAT's own websites. Their materials only go back to 2007 with an annual report there, and there's no mention of human rights in it. In 2008, the annual report that BAT made available includes one mention for human rights with respect to its employees, but otherwise pretty barren. But in 2009, BAT issued its first sustainability report, and this document includes 36 references to human rights, noting the importance to BAT of monitoring human rights in its supply chain and taking measures to reduce violations such as with child labor. As time progresses, we see both a proliferation of BAT materials, sustainability reports, harm reduction reports, mandatory modern slavery reports, as well as mentions for human rights. Things begin to really take off in 2011, when BAT first, so far as we could tell, referenced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as international organizations promoting human rights, like the International Labor Organization. There is not any deep discussion or analysis of what these human rights are, even within the parameters of employment and the supply chain, but there is the beginning of a common statement that appears across multiple documents. The phrase, "We have a long-standing commitment to respect fundamental human rights," as affirmed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This phrase, or ones very similar to it, becomes standard in materials after 2011. But what these rights are, BAT doesn't really say. There are a lot of fundamental human rights, some enumerated, some not. UDHR Article 25 is a core legal basis for the human right to health, but there's no mention to that anywhere in all of BAT's materials. BAT never mentioned or discussed the right to health. BAT's mention of human rights is general, and it's generally pretty vague. Still, BAT's references to human rights begin to tick up in the following years after 2011. Many of these references are similar to one another, so it's hard to measure growth or depth in BAT's thinking about them. It would seem all BAT was doing was saying the same vague things more often. An opportunity arose in 2013 for BAT to be reflective in this manner when it convened a stakeholder dialogue specifically on human rights. The dialogue remained limited to supply chain issues, employee relations, and corporate conduct, but it did provide BAT with some feedback that challenged the company to go beyond its narrow concept of what human rights should mean to it. Whomever the participant was that provided this quote on the slide, BAT felt their comment warranted a highlight in their own document. Whether participants also discussed health and consumers and human rights beyond, such as a consumer's right to health, is unknown, but a rights holder's perspective necessarily implicates the people who interact with the company but are outside of the supply chain. They too have human rights. Earlier I mentioned choice, and choice may in fact be the only thing BAT is willing to champion, as we see them saying echoes of the same thing across multiple documents and across multiple years. There's a truth to that argument. The World Health Organization considers the right to control one's health part and parcel to the right to health, and international treaties like the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women recognize a woman's right to bodily integrity. In other words, a woman's right to choose. These recognitions haven't ever been extended to the idea that anyone has a right to a tobacco product, to choose to consume a tobacco product, but there is a principle that BAT and the industry is eager to work into their interests, especially where they can connect that choice to another goal, like the UN SDGs, and SDG 3 in particular. BAT again went under the lens from its own stakeholder panel in 2020 with regards to the human rights connection to the health risks of its products. So very pointed. BAT's response was to point to its human rights report, released in 2020, which, as you heard me say, is not any deeper than any of those earlier materials. That is, except with respect to harm reduction, and BAT's harm reduction narrative promoting its next generation products. Even BAT is not so bold as to say there's a human right to consume their products, but other people have made that argument, people funded by or supportive of the industry. And BAT's use of human rights in and around their promotion of their commercialized harm reduction is suggestive at the very least. So what BAT has done is put all of these terms literally on the same page and leave it to someone else to draw connections. So when all is said and done, it's really hard to say what BAT considers its transformative history. They created new programs and projects and began admitting that their combustible products are harmful. They seem to have taken to heart the interests of labor rights, discourage slavery and child workers, promote gender equity and inclusion, though they've been criticized for turning a blind eye to all of the same things that I just mentioned. It's safe to say BAT is openly discussing human rights more than they were in the 1990s, but what they're saying isn't really any better or different even, say for wanting to insert their next generation products into that same discussion. It's still the same company that wants to sell its inherently hazardous products, both the new stuff along with the old. So the main takeaway here is simple. Don't buy what they're selling. The paper on this work is available at Tobacco Control. That is the article title. You can look it up there if you're more interested. Thank you for following along, and by all means, reach out if you have any questions, comments, or concerns which we can address.